Is it a good idea or a bad idea to own the home that you live in? Personal finance experts are divided. Today, I'm going to give you the Nomad Capitalist perspective. So I'm going to share with you an article from CNBC where one American financial advisor says it's a terrible idea to own a home. I'm going to go through that article in a moment and share with you what I think are some misconceptions. Obviously, there are people who say, hey, control your housing cost, buy a home, pay down the mortgage, or pay cash for a home. I'm going to share with you the entrepreneur's perspective as someone who has lived all around the world for over a decade now, someone who does own properties in 6 different cities, what I would call lifestyle real estate properties where I actually go and spend time. And so if it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consultancy that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. That means lower taxes, more diversified assets, second citizenship, more freedom, all basically diversifying yourself all around the world. And we also host the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live, and that's open to absolutely everybody. So my perspective, just before we get into this, is I do own what I would call lifestyle real estate in 6 different cities around the world. In some cases, I'm in a transition period where there may be 2 different properties in one particular city because I bought up. So in some cases, those have either directly led to a residence or citizenship application where I've basically built up my optionality of places in the world to go, whether I want more places that have low or no taxes, whether I want just another passport that gives me more options and makes me a slave to no country. Either the real estate directly allowed me to file for residence or citizenship, or it supported an application where, hey, if you had a property, you would have a better chance at getting this. And it's like, okay, I wouldn't mind having a property. And so for me, a couple misconceptions is because I live overseas, because I run a growing business, and because I do live rather frugally, including very nominal amounts of tax that I'm paying, much less than I paid in the United States. My lifestyle real estate is a single-digit percentage net worth. I don't know if it's what exactly it is, single digits, and I'm not counting enterprise values of companies. I'm just counting stocks, bonds, cryptocurrencies, baseball cards, cash in the bank, gold coins, whatever. And for that, all the properties worldwide are a single-digit percentage of my net worth. So it's a sign of the fact that I'm not going at there over leveraging myself. I don't live in a Western country where I'm basically keeping up with the Joneses and putting everything I have into a property, mortgaging it. I have absolutely no debt. I'm a security-minded person, and so I like having plenty of other investments, other cash to put into deals, other whatever. So that's what the properties are. And I don't live in mega mansions. Certainly, for the longest time, a lot of my properties are pied-à-terres around the world in city centers. I don't own a car anywhere, and so my footprint in a lot of those places is smaller than what people might expect. People say, oh, okay, well, this guy's business isn't doing as well as maybe it is. I like the kind of Warren Buffett approach. He takes the extreme approach of just being relatively frugal. I do believe in living in a certain amount of luxury, living in a certain amount of comfort. I like certain decor, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I like to have things the way I want them. I don't want to be moving out of a place every year or 2 years, especially overseas when a landlord may have more privileges to ask you to leave, or maybe just difficult to deal with some of the landlords, or just cultural disagreements. So I like the idea of living in a certain amount of comfort, but certainly I could probably afford to live in a much greater level of comfort and luxury than I do. Now, all that said, let me go through this article from CNBC. Here's a wealth manager who says buying a home is usually a terrible investment. Here's why. Now, obviously, the advice on CNBC Make It is not necessarily directed, even though CNBC is supposed to be a business channel for business people, not necessarily directed at entrepreneurs and investors. We're talking to 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors. Now, when you get into 10-figure entrepreneurs and investors, sometimes there are people who are like, I don't want to own anything. I'm in the spotlight. Leave me alone. No doubt I'm in the spotlight, but I found that, having the property, you can kind of provide kind of built-in good enough asset protection. But certainly, if you're at a very high level, you may want to own nothing. If you're just a 7- or 8-figure entrepreneur, you run an e-commerce business, you have an agency, my opinion is, and I'll tell you why, there could be some great benefits in owning a home or homes around the world. Here's the article. A lot of people will tell you that buying a home is a good investment, but quote unquote, that couldn't be further from the truth, says Peter Maluk, a certified financial planner. In reality, it's usually a terrible investment, he says. That's because at the end of the day, owning a home takes money out of your pocket. You're paying property taxes, you're paying maintenance, you're paying insurance. These are all the other things that happen with your home that you've got to pay for. Now, I'm assuming, this is a pretty smart guy, if you rent, you are also paying property taxes, maintenance, and insurance. It's just baked into rent. Now, I happen to be, and we've built kind of a business around saying, here's the price. That's pretty much the entire price. Maybe there's a few bucks out of your own pocket, but here's the price, right? And so I'm all for here's the price and having everything baked into one flat price that you basically have predictability every month. You can build around that. Whereas when you own a home, something breaks, or there's if you live in an apartment building, they have a kind of a levy, or property taxes go up. I mean, you have some kind of certainty with rent. But these things are baked in. And by the way, if property taxes go up, your rent may increase as much as the law allows the next time when the landlord is allowed to charge you more. So you are absolutely paying these things. So that seems a little bit silly. But the article continues, young homeowners in particular have figured out the hard way. Underestimating the hidden cost is the number one reason millennials who do own homes have regrets. Over time, your home might increase in value, he says, but it probably won't appreciate enough to offset all the costs. Instead, if you took what you'd save from not buying a house and invested it in something that's likely to grow in value, such as stocks and bonds, chances are you'd end up with more money in the long term. Now listen, I'm pretty transparent here. I think you should invest in things like asset protection. You should have your business offshore. You should have residences and citizenships. Yeah, you know what? At Nomad Capitalist, that happens to be in our business. We happen to talk about that stuff, and I was doing that stuff before people came to us and started asking for help many years ago, and we turned it into a business. But nevertheless, that is something that we do. So, hey, listen, I think as part of owning property, you should try and own a second home or a third home where you can get a residence or a citizenship in a country that gives you diversification and gives you optionality to where if your country goes nuts, you've got a place to go and you don't have to deal with their rules, tax hikes, regulations, what have you. But it's not lost to me that a guy who manages, presumably, stocks and bonds wants to put your money in stocks and bonds. So that's that. Say you live in Brooklyn, New York, and you pay $2,500 a month in rent. If you buy your own place, you might pay $5,000 a month between your mortgage, taxes, and maintenance costs. He gives as an example. Other financial experts estimate that thanks to homeownership costs, buying can cost you almost about 40% more than renting. So I'd like to know where this market is where I can basically go and pay half of the carrying cost to own a property in rent, and some person is just losing $2,500 a month on me. Tell me where I can go and do that. And I would presume, maybe if you're in Brooklyn, New York, and you can never be kicked out, and there's rent controls. I don't know. I presume that's how New York City works, though maybe not so much anymore. If you have all kinds of regulations, hey, maybe that makes sense. Most people aren't living in Brooklyn, New York with that level of regulation. And I would imagine most people are paying a lot more in rent than half of what the owner is paying to run the place. Now he says if you take the difference and save it, that extra $2,500 you're saving in a diversified portfolio is almost certainly over a long period of time going to be worth more than what your home equity would have been worth if you had just put the money into a home. Now, here's where I agree with him. The average person who doesn't think as an entrepreneur or investor watches their house go up. I remember living in Phoenix, Arizona before the global financial crisis, and we were in the advertising business. I was really young back then, but it was just starting out. And every real estate agent, every mortgage broker, everybody was like, hey, take money out of your house. Rates are low, at least low for back then. And you can pay off debt. And people would pay off their debts, and then they'd go get into more debt, or they'd go buy a Sea-Doo, or they'd go buy a pontoon boat, or they'd go do renovations to their house. And then eventually they were complaining a couple of years later when they couldn't pay their mortgage, which was now much higher than it could have been because they took out money to pay for all their frivolous spending because they thought the party would never end. Basically, their home equity was a bank account. It was pretty much their only bank account because they had no other money saved in most cases. And so I learned right then and there that people will waste money. They don't pay attention to any principles of general finance. They're not teaching this in the school system. And then when the bank came and took their home, not saying that that there weren't situations that were very unfortunate, but for that kind of person that I saw a lot of in Phoenix, Arizona, then it was, oh my God, someone's got to do something about this. Why isn't the government stepping in? Why isn't someone forcing people to and then they would play games and be what I think is very unethical, oh, I'll just keep living in the house for 2 years and you have so many houses you're going to foreclose on, good luck, come and take mine. You borrowed the money, you took the money out, you wasted it on a bunch of crap because you have no idea how to manage money, and then when a problem came, it's oh, someone's got to do something about this, which is why I say, if you're living in a Western country, the idea of, for example, buying real estate to get residence or get citizenship in another country is one of the best insurance policies you can have right now as a successful person, because chances are, when it hits the fan the next time in the Western world, what are people going to be crying out for? Why don't the rich pay more taxes? How did we get ourselves into this situation? It's not the government mismanaged it. It's, oh my goodness, things are tough right now. right? As the world becomes more competitive, as governments in the West mismanage their economies and steer towards disaster, people won't pay attention to that. They'll just say, oh my goodness, it's hard for me to live, take more of that guy's money and give it to me. That's exactly what many politicians from Bernie Sanders on down are saying. Why? It's the same thing we saw in the global financial crisis. And I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to absolutely every person, but I'm saying there are plenty of people who could have taken much greater financial responsibility and are going to ask you to pay the tab because you have the money later. That's not necessarily apropos to this conversation, but I think relevant. Most people, by the way, are not going to take the extra $2,500 a month if they're renting and put it in. They're going to spend some money, going on a trip. Nothing wrong with that, but they're not going to spend the money. Perhaps some people need a kind of a forced savings account. If you're a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur investor, then you don't need that. But I'll come back to why it's a good idea in a moment. Then he talks about Ramit Sethi, self-made millionaire and author of I Will Teach You to Be Rich, has made the same. Generally, we can assume over the long term, if we invest in a low-cost, diversified index fund, we get about 7% in terms of returns. Can you beat that in your area over time with real estate appreciation? We're now seeing, I think I saw recently, over 400 U.S. cities have not even come back to even with the levels before the global financial crisis, before the Great Recession. So go back to like 06, 07, you've got something like 400 cities, presumably, some kind of, Davenport, Iowa or something, right? Not back to where it was. And so, yeah, as much as Miami or New York, Brooklyn, right, Los Angeles, those cities, I guess, did pretty well. A lot of big cities around the world have done pretty well. The average person living in, for example, the United States has not really seen a great deal of appreciation. And so the idea is, for me, if I'm a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur, I already have enough money to put in stocks and bonds and other diversified assets. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, the first cost I'm going to get rid of is I'm going to get rid of my big tax cost. And I'm going to say, listen, I don't recommend people move from California to Texas or to Florida. Certainly if you're making $1 million a year, that's going to save you something. And you could put that money, instead of this alleged deficiency in rent, into a savings account. My suggestion is you go where you're treated best, and if you're an American, you move to Puerto Rico or you move offshore. If you're from anywhere else, there's 252 countries and territories in the world to choose from. Plenty of them have very low tax rates from 0, 1, 2, 5, 10. You can dramatically reduce your taxes. And so if you're making $1 million, $2 million, $5 million a year, you're talking pretty substantial savings by going from 40 or 50 down to 7%. And so you can afford to basically slice off and basically cash flow part of that, right? Go to a place, take Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, okay? I think compared to Davenport, Iowa, for example, a relatively world-class city compared to, not necessarily compared to a handful of other cities where ultra-high net worth individuals are, but for someone who wants a relaxed lifestyle where they kind of have the best of both worlds, up and coming and developed enough, it's a nice place to go. You can buy a beautiful property for $500,000, $1 million, depending on where you live. It's one of the few places in Asia where you can actually own a home. You can own the land underneath you. And you can benefit from a very, very generous tax policy for people who have businesses overseas. And so you can do that all in Malaysia. You're making $2 million a year. You might save $800,000. And so you could just basically roll up, hey, in the 6, 7, 8 months while you're preparing to live in Malaysia, you could basically cash flow that $500,000 property and then move in. And so now you have no debt, whereas you might have debt in your country. And you're going to be diverting a lot more money because the cost of living is lower. The cost of property is really low. You've got a relatively saturated housing market that, in all fairness, may not work itself out for a while. But I'm looking at it as a lifestyle investment, that it's a place where, and by the way, your place could be any number of other places. It could be Bangkok, it could be Panama City, it could be Dublin, Ireland, it could be Zurich, Switzerland, it could be any number of places that are tax friendly, Milan, Italy, okay? Some of those may be harder to cash flow depending on your income, but the idea being you're going to reduce your cost of living a little bit, you're going to dramatically reduce your tax bill, you're going to have a lot more money to put back because you're no longer, owning a $5 million property in Brooklyn, New York, or in, Sydney, Australia, or in London, England, whatever the case may be. So you've now basically eliminated a big line item. You don't have a mortgage. You don't have a tax bill. Your cost of living has gone down. You want to talk about putting if we're going to put $2,500 a month, why not just put as much as we possibly can? And so you put that money away, and you're living in a place where you're now living intentionally, where it has changed my life to live overseas. And especially to live in different places. So I'll live in Kuala Lumpur a few months a year, and then I'll go live in Bogota, Colombia, and then I'll go live in different places. And so I can cash flow different properties around the world, which give me different exposure. And so now, as someone who's growing a business, I don't just have the US angle, which is what I did many years ago. Now I've got the angle of I have homes on 3 different continents, and I spend my time all around the world, and I interact with all different kinds of people, and I constantly have new business ideas. I constantly hear about opening new markets. I constantly see what's happening in different parts of the world, in parts of the world that maybe are more recession resistant, parts of the world that are faster growth, parts of the market that maybe your competitors aren't looking at, and that's going to be your ticket to growth. And so if I'm a business owner or an investor, I could look for the next investment idea. I want to be in some of these markets. And so I'm going to have so much extra money from all those 3 things I'm saving on to put back into the property. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to add a lifestyle benefit. I do not want, as someone who's running a business, to deal with landlords. I want to be able to, fill my places up with clothing. I want to decorate them the way I want. I don't want to have to fear that, hey, the landlord needs a place to move back in, so pack up your stuff and move it on, Skippy. I like to really, put stuff on my walls. I like to pick out, nice lamps. I like to pick out a nice rug. I like to, paint things the way I want. And I've lived in a couple of locations in rented properties, when I was younger. And they're like, oh, no, Doug, please don't hang a picture up. And then you've got like these bare white walls that for me is really kind of depressing. And I think influences performance. When I have an office that I just love going to because I have everything the way I want it, I've got the sofa that I invent. Like I know I never have to move it again, so I can get the heaviest, the most different. I can get whatever I want. I can get the rug. Like I can really invest in it, knowing that hey, even if I want to leave for a year. And by the way, I spent 0 time in Kuala Lumpur in 2021 because it wasn't as open. It's the first year I ever didn't spend time in Kuala Lumpur in almost a decade, and so I had stuff that was just sitting in Kuala Lumpur, and hey, no worries, I'll come back to it eventually. The rug's not going bad, but what if it was a situation where, hey, during the pandemic, the landlord wants to do this or that, or who knows what happens? To me, there's a lifestyle benefit that if you can, align your cost of housing, not because you're living in Brooklyn where you're going to spend millions of dollars and you're going to take out debt and you're going to kind of put a greater burden on your cash flow, but if you can cash flow the actual purchase itself, reduce your tax costs, reduce your cost of living, open up new opportunities. I think you're, quite frankly, I've said before, if you move overseas, you're going to make more money because by lowering your taxes, you're going to be more motivated and you're going to find more opportunities. Your income is going to grow. That'll pay for the housing. But I also think that from a lifestyle perspective, owning that property in the most secure way possible, if you can without debt, is going to allow you to be a lot more productive. And so CNBC, kind of the average financial advisor, may not, or the financial advisor is talking to the average person rather, they it's just, okay, this is good advice if you make $72,000 a year. Nothing wrong with it, by the way. Our channel is talking to 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors who I think don't perhaps invest enough in their surroundings. I've been to highly successful people's homes, but they're just starting out and they haven't figured out living in a shoebox or living in a place where they don't feel comfortable is going to have an impact on their productivity. I can tell you, having upgraded to, from the pied-a-terre to in Kuala Lumpur, kind of a really substantial sized property, I don't want to leave so much. I'm focused more on getting stuff done. Whereas if I'm in a pied-a-terre, sometimes I want to go to a cafe, I'll take my laptop, and you kind of just lose productivity from deep work. So again, if you're just going to a job, I would even say if you're a remote worker, having a comfortable space that you control is valuable. But if you are, building a business, if you're building an investment portfolio, you want to have as much control over your environment as possible. That's what you're doing in your business is how do I maintain as much control over my entire environment? And yet people I see don't do that in their housing. So I believe, especially if you can do this in conjunction with the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle, if you can get a residence or citizenship permit, if you can reduce your taxes in a place where you buy the property, having this property that you own is beneficial. And I wouldn't call that a terrible investment. I would call it, even if the property is not growing in value, I would call it an investment in yourself to create more money. And so that's what I'm focused on, is how do I use all the different things that I'm doing in my life to increase my income and increase my bottom line. I think owning property and properties contributes to that.